The third important distinctive feature of this translation, again, is something that I'd like to explain slightly more, and that is that there are certain verses, or not just certain verses, I would say, there is a whole lot of verses in the Quran which often have been misinterpreted. And one of the reasons for this misinterpretation is that we interpret the Quran out of context. So there are certain verses which have a very specific message, but if we neglect that context, we might end up extracting something which is never meant in the Quran to be understood. Let me give you a couple of examples to just to understand how at times, by neglecting the context, we end up with a different understanding of the Quran. So this is the third distinctive feature, besides that intellectual approach, besides that moral grounding with the Almighty. The third important area is that if we neglect the context, we would end up with a very, very uncharacteristic understanding or interpretation of the Quran. So you must have heard of this verse which says, "Inna hazihi ummatukum ummatan wahida," which means this ummah of yours is one ummah. And there are people who argue in favor of pan-Islamism, or the fact that because we are one ummah, so therefore we should be one ummah. I mean, when the verse says that you are one ummah, the actual implication is that you should be one ummah. And so people think that, or scholars do think at times, that the Quran is telling us that all Muslim countries should unite and form a Islamic bloc, maybe. Pan-Islamism is something which we know Jamaluddin Afghani was very, very vocal about, and then we had Allama Iqbal and some of the other thinkers as well. So some of them argued in favor of pan-Islamism on the basis of this Quranic verse that "Inna hazi ummatukum ummatun wahida," that your ummah has to be one ummah, implying that there should be political unity. Now, if you pick up the verse in the Quran and you place it in context, you'll find an entirely different picture which the Quran is presenting. So this verse actually occurs after a number of verses which say that prophets were sent with the same message. So when Noah was sent, he was sent with the message of Tawheed, and David and Solomon and all the Israelite prophets and Jesus right till the end. They did not differ in the message of what they presented. So it's not that one prophet presented something else and the next prophet came and actually sort of abrogated his message. No, the Quran says that all prophets brought the same message. And once all those prophets have been enlisted, right at the end of that paragraph, you'll find this verse, "Inna hazi ummatukum ummatun wahida," referring to the fact that all these prophets of God have been one ummah because they have brought the same message. They are not different from one another. So you see, if you place the verse in context, it's not referring to pan-Islamism in any way. It is just telling us that these ummah of the prophets, so the word ummah is actually referring to the ummah or the group of prophets which are mentioned prior to that verse. Because we have, neglected the previous part of the verse, concentrated more on what that particular verse says, because it's a beautiful, I would say, corroboration from the Quran, if I get this corroboration in favor of pan-Islamism, that yes, even the Quran tells us that we have to be a single Muslim bloc. But in the context, as I said, the word ummah does not refer to the ummah, the Muslim ummah. It refers to the ummah of the prophets, that they were one. So don't think that when you face a new prophet or a new prophet comes, he's coming with a different message. It was always Islam. From Adam to Muhammad, the religion was Islam. And all these ummah of the prophets, they were one in their message. To give you another example, this is an example that you might relish even more because it relates to our practical lives. And that is that you must have heard of this fact that when you touch the Quran, you must be in the state of ceremonial cleanliness, which is called wuzu. So generally it is said that if you are without wuzu, you just cannot touch the Quran, because the Quran at one place says in Surah Waqia, "La yamassuhu illa al-mutahharun," only the pure touch it. Only the pure touch it. And obviously, if I interpret this verse without any consideration of the context, my own interpretation, as has been the case with so many people, would be that yes, the ritually pure are the people who can touch it. So if you're not you're not wuzu, you're not in the state of wuzu, you should not touch it, because the Quran says, "La yamassuhu illa al-mutahharun," only the pure touch it. Now, if you place this verse again in the context, and you look at the verses prior to this verse, and you look at the verses which are succeeding this verse, you'll find out an entirely different notion which is being discussed in the Quran. And what is being discussed is that, look here, these Quraysh, they argued in the favor of the fact that these evil spirits, these dirty jinn, they reveal the Quran on the heart of the Prophet. And this is not so. As far as the Quran is concerned, it is revealed by pure individuals, by pure spirits, referring to the angels of God. So the mutahharun word is not referring to people who are pure. It is referring to the fact that it's not that these evil spirits are bringing down the Quran to the heart of the Prophet. It is these noble angels who are pure souls who are bringing down the Quran to the person of the Prophet. And so you can clearly see that this verse, La yamassuhu illal mutahharun, is actually referring to the fact that contrary to what the Ishmaelites or the Quraysh thought, that the Quran is something which has been inspired in the mind of the Prophet through an evil spirit or group of evil spirits, is brought down by angels of God. So you see how a verse, when not interpreted in its context, can lead to an entirely different interpretation. So if you remove the previous part and you interpret the verse to mean that only the pure touch it, obviously you'll be inclined to believe that person who is in the state of ceremonial cleanliness is being implied. Whereas, of course, it's an entirely different scenario when you look at the context. Another example might again be helpful in making you understand how at times the context is so important that if you don't give due regard to this context, then you are once again led to an entirely different conclusion. And this is something which I would explain by saying that there are certain harsh verses of the Quran, certain not even harsh, I would say very stern verses of the Quran, like for example, verses which say that you strike off the heads of the disbelievers or you kill the disbelievers. And something less than that would be that you don't make friends with disbelievers or don't make friends with the Jews and Christians. But of course, friendship is one thing, and chopping off their heads and killing them is something even more. So you find the Almighty telling the believers on many occasions that if they don't desist from their disbelief, فَقْتُلُوهُمْ حَيْثُ سَقِفْتُمُوهُمْ, which means that wherever you find them, just put them to death. And it is such verses which have inspired the likes of Abu Bakr Baghdadi, Mullah Umar, Osama bin Laden, and a host of other people in history who think that all disbelievers have to be put to death because they don't deserve to live. And the Almighty has actually told us that you have to chop off the necks of these mushrikun or these idolaters. So therefore, this is an ideal which is in front of many Muslim preachers. And I can recall, maybe some of you do also recall, that this was back in 1994 when Osama had not become very famous. So he had a very famous consultation in Khost in Afghanistan. Is a place. He came out of that meeting and he flashed a Quranic verse from Surah Tawbah which said, "Qatilu a'immat al-kufr," that you fight with these leaders of disbelief. And he said that the number one leader of disbelief is the United States of America. So I declare war on the US. And although this was in 1994, and people thought, well, I mean, no one took notice of that. But you can well imagine that in 6 years or 7 years, what he did ultimately was, of course, something that he had promised to do. So people like him, and then even before that, you'll find these verses giving inspiration to a lot of minds that, yes, this is how we have to behave, that we Muslims are superior as far as our integrity is concerned, as far as being the chosen people of God are concerned. And with the advent of the last prophet, we have been given this mandate to clean this earth, to cleanse this earth from the filth of disbelief and establish the religion of God on the face of the earth. And so this is a mission that we have to follow. So therefore, if for this we end up killing people, that is absolutely fine. So you see, this is one of the greatest things that has happened in this era, which is perhaps the cause of the doctrine of Islamophobia. So when people think that the verses of the Quran are verses which actually inspire you to kill non-Muslims, which they instigate you, they encourage you, they urge you, then what is it that should stop us? I mean, shouldn't then we be praising the likes of Osama bin Laden and his accomplices and associates that, well, they followed the book of God and they did what was required to do? So, I mean, either we are left with the choice of praising them because what they did was written in the book of God, or there is something seriously wrong in their understanding, and maybe there was something else at stake and they misunderstood or perhaps rightly understood. So, one of the biggest challenges which the Quran has faced in recent times is that terrorism has drawn its inspiration from the book of God. And if you remember, I mean, you will not be remembering if you've gone through British history. So William Gladstone was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom 4 times. This was in the 19th century. So he's the only British Prime Minister to have held office 4 times. And about him, it is said in history that he, in the British Parliament, referred to the Quran and said that as long as this book exists in this world, there cannot be world peace, because it talks about, I mean, it talks about Muslim supremacy, it talks about chopping off the heads of non-Muslims, it talks about this superiority of the Muslim blood. And so therefore, it also talks about the fact that you must not pray for non-Muslims, there's no istighfar for non-Muslims, etc. So it looks down upon people who are not Muslims. It virtually has no place for them. And not only in this world, but in the next world, it has decided that every non-Muslim and every kafir has to go to hell. So what exactly is this book about? And so when people like us, or of course many of us Muslims, when you read this Quranic verse that لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, that in the life of the Prophet you have the best example. And when you read verses like the Prophet being ordered to kill non-Muslims, you would say that yes, since he is the best of examples, and since he has been ordered to kill non-Muslims or the kafirs, so therefore, I mean, we have to follow suit. So because we are his followers, and there's no going back in it. So it is here that I was referring to the fact that either they are doing exactly the right thing which the Quran has told them, or maybe there's this lack of understanding on their part which has given them an entirely different picture of Islam. So I would like to present before you an alternative explanation of these verses, again with reference to the context. The context is the whole Quran, and that context tells you that this killing of non-Muslims is something which is totally unjustified in today's period. In the times of the prophets of God, it is a very specific law which comes into action, which comes into play, and authorizes them to punish people for denying the truth. And this is something that we, in our own era, and I call this the post-prophetic era, the era in which we live, in which the last prophet of God has left us about 1500 years ago. So we are living in an era in which the prophets of God no longer come. So there is a law in the era of the messengers of God. As per this law, we are all we are told that messengers of God are sent on this world. In this world, they are sent with the message of truth, and once they have delivered the truth to their adversaries, a lesser day of judgment is formed in their own times, so that this lesser day of judgment could become a proof of that greater day of judgment which is going to take place one day for everyone. So in the times of the messengers of God, what happens is that God punishes the nations who have deliberately denied the truth. So there's no question of any ignorance, there's no question of any misunderstanding, because God makes sure that once messengers of God are sent, they are sent with such clarity and such proof that only if people have they cannot have any excuse to deny, because everything is made so clear to them. So the Almighty tells us that just as people would be punished in the hereafter for that deliberate denial, they are punished in the times of messengers of God as well for this deliberate denial. And so therefore, in the times of the previous messengers, like for example, the nations of Ad and Samud and the people of Lot, they were destroyed for deliberately denying their messengers. So in the times of, in ancient times, they were destroyed by natural disasters like earthquakes and tempests and storms. But in the times of the Prophet of God, these instruments of God's justice, so to speak, were replaced by the swords of the believers. And it was said that now if these people intentionally deny the truth that has been brought by the last messenger, then they will be punished. And this punishment is going to be very similar to the punishment that is going to take place in the hereafter. So in the hereafter, the mushrikun or shirk or polytheism is unforgivable. And in this world also, it will be unforgivable. So the mushrikun have to be put to death. And so therefore, this was a prerogative of only the messengers of God. And God said that in their times, it is me who is manifesting myself on earth, and they are my representatives. I'm going to punish these people for shirk in the hereafter, and I'm going to do them in this world also, because during the time of my messengers, I make it sure that this truth is delivered to them in its ultimate form, and any denial on their part is punished with these ultimate consequences. So you see, this law, which was meant specifically in the era of God's messengers, which was implemented as an instrument of God's justice, even in which the messengers themselves had no say. It was like God taking matters in his own hands and destroying people or punishing them for their misconduct. And this has ended with the departure of the last prophet. It cannot be extended in the post-prophetic era, because it is in the prophetic era that the Almighty makes sure that the truth is unveiled in its ultimate form, because the messenger is doing that. In the post-prophetic era, this cannot, we cannot say that. Any of us is not in a position to unfold the truth or unveil the truth in its ultimate form. We are full of errors and omissions. We just cannot have that status. Only God's messengers have that status. So in the post-prophetic era, we have to realize that all people who are not Muslims, they cannot be punished in any way. You have to come close to them, you have to make friends with them, you have to be in a socially good contact with them, and above all realize that the Jews and the Christians which the Quran mentions are not the same Jews and Christians which are living today in the United States. Because the Jews and Christians of the times of the Prophet Muhammad, they were unveiled the truth by the Prophet himself, and they were left with no excuse. And because excuse is something which is related to our heart's intention, so even God's messengers don't know whether the person who is in front of them is intentionally lying or not. God tells his messenger through divine revelation that, look, now you have delivered the truth to the ultimate extent. Now if they are not accepting, it's not because of any misunderstanding. It's because now they have understood, but out of arrogance they are denying. So this is what happens in the prophetic era. This cannot be extended into the post-prophetic era. And the cardinal mistake which has been done by not understanding this context of the Quran is that we have actually extended something which was specifically meant for the prophetic era into the post-prophetic era. And the prerogative which was meant for the messengers of God has been extended to people who live in the post-prophetic era. And therefore, if Mullah Omar and the likes of him, they punish people for this, or they attack people for this, they think that they are justified, without realizing that this was something that they were never ever given the authority. This was the authority of God, who manifested that authority before his messengers. And so therefore, unless you give this thing due regard, you will end up people being punished for their polytheism, for their disbelief, and for apostasy in this world, whereas this is the prerogative of God only. And he did so in the times of his messengers. He'll do it again on the day of judgment. But in between that era in which we are living, the post-prophetic era, this law is not to be invoked. So today we have to live in peace with them. So these incidents in which shrines are blown up because they think that they are centers of polytheism, you must have heard about so many shrines being blown up by bombs, simply because they thought that polytheism is, or people are prostrating on these shrines, and thereby furthering the cause of polytheism. All these things, if they exist today, we have to bear with them. We have to, be in a position to communicate with them the message of religion, and at the same time also understand that as far as religion itself is concerned, it has to be understood in the light of this divine guidance, that the Quran has a specific context. If that context is not understood, you'll end up generalizing a lot of verses which are specifically meant for the messengers of God. So I'm going to just sum up my introduction to this book by once again reiterating that the first contribution which you can find when you read this translation is that it links you to the Almighty through your own intellect, through your own reasoning, your reasoning faculty. You find yourself attached to the Almighty in a very strong way, because intellect and reasoning is something which really make you convinced of a certain reality. And not only convinced yourself, you are in a position to convince other people, or at least argue and reason out with them, which gives you a lot of confidence, and it makes that relationship with God a very, very living relationship. The second thing which this translation I just spoke about is the fact that on the one hand, it links your intellect to God, and on the other hand, it links your moral being, your inner person, your character towards the Almighty in a very strong way. And it makes you realize that as far as the tenets of morality are concerned, they are inborn. You don't need to find out truth and justice and righteousness from any person else other than your own self, because you have this treasure of morality found in your own self. All that you need to do is that when the Quran speaks of morality, it reminds you of the morality that you already have in your own self. So the Quran is not informing you about morality for the first time. It's just reminding you that you already have in your own self. So in this way, the book of God, when you read it through in this way, it links your inner person, it links your inner being to God in a very, very, I would say, in a way in which you find that your own personal and moral ideals are fulfilled. And the third thing that I talked about while I was introducing this translation is that it has a very special reference to the context approach, in which it means that when you interpret the Quran, you just cannot interpret the Quran out of context. And if you do so, as I gave certain examples, you'll end up misinterpreting the book of God. So, la yamassuhu lil mutahharun does not mean that you have to be in a state of ritual purity to read the Quran. It is referring to the angels who were bringing down the Quran at that time. Similarly, inna hazi ummatukum ummatun wahida does not mean that you have to go for a pan-Islamic polity in which all Muslims or Muslim states have to unite. Yes, if they do it out of their own wish, this is not a problem, but it's not a religious directive at all. And the context tells us that, yes, this is something which was spoken of the Ummah of the Prophets, that they brought on the same message. And finally, the fourth thing which I talked about is the fact that there are certain specific religious verses, or there are certain specific areas of the Quran that can be understood if we study the complete Quran in a way that we are able to understand that there is a basic law which is described in a very profound way in the Quran, and that law only relates to God's messengers. It cannot be extended to people beyond His messengers, and that law is that God's messengers are authorized on behalf of God to punish people for denying the truth. And this is like creating a lesser day of judgment on the face of the earth before that greater day of judgment, so that these lesser days of judgment, whenever they are created in the times of different messengers, they become an argument in favor of that greater day. For people like us who are living in the post-prophetic era, people like us whose fate is not yet decided. So remember, the fate of the nations of the prophets of God, that fate is decided in this world. So they are rewarded or punished in this world. But people like us who are living in the post-prophetic era, our fate has been deferred to the day of judgment. So for us, we have to continuously read the fate of the previous nations in the Quran, and then derive the fact that if our fate, or if we are not meeting our fate in this world, then this is not something that is going to end like this. We will be meeting our fate, or we will be meeting our accountability on a day of judgment which is going to follow. So if we don't understand this, we will end up misinterpreting a lot of verses of the Quran, particularly verses which are extremely harsh or extremely retributive in nature, and not realize that this is God's law meant for certain people who lived in the era of the messengers of God, and cannot be extended to people who are living in the post-prophetic era. So I'm just going to end my talk here. And of course, whatever I presented here is not because, it's not that it's something that you might be convinced of immediately, but maybe some food for thought for you. And maybe, as they say, that the proof of the pudding lies in its eating. So maybe one day when you are able to read the translation, or if you've gone through it, perhaps you'll be in a better position to either corroborate what I have said, or maybe even negate what I have said. So thank you very much. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين.